It is my pleasure to introduce Dalia Mogahed, someone whose work I have covered and have been familiar with since my time in the Middle East, but also here. She is Director of Research at the Institute for Social Policy and Understanding, where she leads the organization's pioneering research and thought leadership programs on American Muslims. She's also former executive director of the Gallup Center for Muslim Studies. She served on an advisory council for President Obama and has testified before the Senate on the issues she'll be talking about today. So all that to say, if you have questions about Muslim public opinion, this is the woman to ask. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Good morning. My name's Dalia Mogahed. I'm visibly Muslim. I'm also a woman. I'm an immigrant. And I'm a scientist. So I'm very popular these days. I'm really excited to talk to you about a topic that is often misunderstood. I'm going to discuss Islamophobia. And I'm going to make the case that it's not just a threat to people like me, that it's a threat to every single person in this room who cares about democracy and freedom. Briefly, I'm going to explain what I mean by Islamophobia. I'm going to explain, or try to explain, why there might be so much of it right now. And then I'm going to end with what is the impact of Islamophobia on every single one of us. So when I say Islamophobia, I don't mean questioning Islam, criticizing Islam. I mean a very specific kind of bigotry that's based on fear of Islam, and it affects real people. So it's anti-Muslim bigotry and discrimination based on an irrational fear of the faith. Now, why? Why is there so much Islamophobia? The answer I usually get, and I would also give before I looked at the data, was 9/11. Now, some of you perhaps were children when this occurred, but I think most of us remember this horrific day. And I had always attributed anti-Muslim sentiment to this monstrous event. But then I saw this data, and it kind of blew me away, that when you compare American public opinion of Muslims before and after 9/11, what you find is there was actually a slight improvement. That Americans had a more favorable opinion of Muslims right after 9/11 than they did right before. So when does anti-Muslim sentiment spike if it's not around the worst terrorist attack on our soil? Well, it's around elections, not terrorist attacks. To be precise, when I looked at when anti-Muslim sentiment spiked in the United States from 2001 to 2013, I found that it happened 3 times, not right after 9/11, but in the run-up to the Iraq War, where there was no new terrorist attack, and during the 2008 and 2012 election cycles. Now, even more strange was that after the Boston bombing, a terrorist attack on our soil by someone who grew up here, there was no change, believe it or not, no change in public opinion regarding Muslims. But among Republicans in 2012, there was a 9-point increase in the sentiment that Islam and violence were connected. Now, I think this should alarm all of us, because it means that Islamophobia is not simply the regrettable but understandable result of bad Muslims doing bad things. It is actually, in many ways, a tool of public manipulation. And here's one thing that fuels it. There is actually an industry. The Islamophobia industry is a well-documented machine where 33 Islamophobic groups had access to more than $200 million between 2008 and 2013. There's also media. Now, I'm not here to bash the media. The media is very important. I like the media. But the media has to do a lot better. According to Media Tenor, it's an organization based in Germany. They're actually a for-profit consulting firm. All they do is media content analysis. They analyze what the media says and how often it says it. That's all they do. And they work for all kinds of organizations who want to know how they're being spoken of in the media. So they apply these same tools to religious communities. And they found that 80 to 90% of coverage of Muslims and Islam in American news media is negative. Now, it was really interesting. This last year, 2016, Fox News scored a perfect 100% score, negative media of Muslims and Islam, something even my immigrant parents would be proud of, right? 100%. I don't have to be asked what happened to the other 2 points. It's all there. The ones laughing have parents like mine. Now compare this to another issue area, just for reference, North Korea, 73% negative media. So you have a state that is designated by our government as a terrorist state that has openly threatened our country with better media coverage than 1.7 billion people living in mostly countries that are allies. Another study found that over the past 25 years, the New York Times portrayed Islam and Muslims more negatively than cancer and cocaine. So the only question I have is not why there's Islamophobia, but wow, why isn't there more of it? And so what is the impact on society? Now, I made the case that it wasn't just a problem for Muslims, but it is also a problem for Muslims in case anyone was wondering. And the first thing simply is just basic things like discrimination. According to one study, Muslims are at least 3, if not 4 times as likely as other faith communities to report discrimination based on their faith. And this discrimination doesn't just pertain to adults. So the same study found that 42% of Muslim American families who have children in grade school their child has experienced bullying in school. And that's far more likely than any other faith community. But what I thought was even more alarming wasn't just that nearly half had been bullied, but that a quarter of those bullied had a teacher involved in the bullying. So it affects Muslims in so many different ways. But here's the thing about bigotry is it spreads. It doesn't just impact one community. Islamophobia also opens the door to other kinds of bigotry, like, for example, anti-Semitism. One study found that the variable most strongly linked to self-reported anti-Muslim prejudice was self-reported anti-Jewish prejudice. That if someone said that they had anti-Jewish bigotry, and this was all self-reported, this was someone who actually admit to having a great deal of prejudice toward Jews. If they had that view, they were 32 times as likely to also have anti-Muslim prejudice. In fact, what really blew us out of the water with this study is that anti-Semitism was the strongest predictor of Islamophobia, stronger than any demographic variable, stronger than political affiliation, even stronger than whether or not that person knew a Muslim. So bigotry spreads. There is a link, an incredibly strong link between Islamophobia and anti-Semitism. But it doesn't just pertain to religious minorities. It pertains to all kinds of marginalized minorities. So we did a study at ISPU where we looked at legislation now, not just public opinion, but policy, how laws work. And here's what we found, that at the state level, legislators who were proposing legislation that restricted the rights of Muslims were also proposing legislation that restricted the rights of African Americans and Latinos' access to the ballot, labor unions, immigrants, women, and the LGBT community. There was actually an 80% overlap between these kinds of legislations. It's not just impacting one community, it's impacting all marginalized communities. But I said it impacts every single American. What if you're not a member of a marginalized community? Then maybe Islamophobia doesn't matter to you. But I'm here to make the case that it does. Because here's the thing about bigotry, especially Islamophobia, it's fueled by fear. Fear of a lack of insecurity, fear of the unknown, fear of people who don't look and pray like the majority. But here's the thing about fear. According to neuroscience, fear makes us more accepting. Now, this is on the neurological level. More accepting of authoritarianism, conformity, and prejudice. 3 factors that corrode the very foundation of our democracy. Fear kills freedom. But it also makes us less safe. So the idea that Islamophobia is somehow good for national security is completely ridiculous. Hate crimes against Muslims have spiked, but again, they're not the only victims of Islamophobia. It also strengthens terrorist rhetoric. If you listen to what terrorists in the name of Islam are saying, they're basically parroting the Islamophobia industry. It's amazing to me how aligned these two groups are. And so Islamophobic rhetoric amplifies and does the propaganda for the terrorist groups. And I'm just going to give you one simple example. This is a screenshot from CNN that was about a propaganda video that came out during our election cycle this last time. And it actually featured a clip of then candidate Donald Trump. It quoted Donald Trump to recruit people to terrorist organizations. It is that linked. When we say that Islamophobic rhetoric helps the terrorists, it's this direct. So in closing, Muslims might be the first to feel it. But like canaries in the coal mine, they're simply an indication of a wider toxic climate that is hurting us all. Thank you.
Thank you, Dalia. I can tell you from looking at this that there aren't going to be any softball questions from this audience. Oh. It's like White House press briefing. We have a lot of questions, not a lot of time, so let's dive right in. The first one, by far, it's pretty controversial. Do you think Islamophobia stems from ideas other than media and terror? And specific examples are Muslim views on women's rights or LGBTQ issues. And maybe this is an opportunity also to talk about some of the findings from your poll just in March, where some of these issues were addressed.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So I think this is a great question. I mean, another way to interpret that question is Islamophobia justified? Meaning, is bigotry against Muslims or negative views of Muslims justified because Muslims have these regressive ideas about women and the LGBT community? So I guess the way to answer that is I think these ideas about what Muslims believe are often misinformed. And part of this idea of Islamophobia is assuming things or generalizing from one point to a much wider community. So one simple example is this issue around women's rights. And yes, our last poll, what we found is that American Muslim women are more educated than American Muslim men, on average. They are more likely to be employed outside the home than the general public's female population. So there's a lot of misconceptions about who Muslims are and what they believe.
And if I'm not mistaken, in that poll, they have the same likelihood as facing domestic violence.
Right, exactly. One of the
point
findings
jumped
is that the occurrence of domestic violence is equal across faith communities. Whether you're Muslim, Christian, or even non-affiliated, you are as likely to report having domestic violence in your community. So these issues, it's not that they're absent in the Muslim community, it's that they're not exclusive to the Muslim community. These are human problems that when they occur in the Muslim community, they're called scary things like honor killings. But when they occur in the general public, they're called domestic homicide. And so I think we have to take a step back and begin to unpack some of our assumptions and universalize some of these issues so that we can actually solve them. I would like to also point out that in the same poll, what we found is that there is an increased amount of solidarity with other communities. So the American Muslim community is one of the most diverse, it's actually the most diverse faith community in the United States.
No single ethnicity dominates.
No single ethnicity dominates. There's no majority race among Muslims. A third of the community is African American. And we found that Muslims generally are the most likely faith community to say that they support Black Lives Matter. It's not just because a third of our community is African American. When you look at non-Black Muslims, the same level of support for Black Lives Matter as you find in the general public among African Americans. So there's a growing consciousness of the need to really align the community with the marginalized.
That's interesting. And there was a question kind of along the lines of that about integration and what role that plays in combating Islamophobia. So the next big question is probably fresh on people's minds after Manchester, London, also Afghanistan, and Baghdad. And that is, do you feel that Islamophobia has also grown with the ongoing attacks on people by groups like ISIS and Al-Qaeda?
Well, I, again, absolutely would have assumed that. And again, nothing is worse than 9/11. Manchester was horrific, but 9/11, 3,000 people died. And if that didn't cause people to increase their unfavorable opinion, then it's very hard to pin Islamophobia on terrorist acts. Terrorist acts are horrible, and we all have to work together to prevent them ever from happening. But I'm making a very controversial point that it is not enough to blame Islamophobia on terrorism because the data just doesn't bear this out.
We only have about a minute left, so I'm going to combine a couple here. I think everybody's here because they want to do something. So one of the just straightforward questions is, what are some strategies to get out of this toxic, perpetual cycle of bigotry? And I would argue that maybe there's a media component, because the next big question is, what's the reaction from media outlets when they read or hear about your research? And, is that one way out of this perpetual cycle that we're talking about today?
Well, I think there's now really good research about unintentional bias or implicit bias. And I think that that's how we should treat all kinds of bigotry, but especially Islamophobia in this case. And the way you address implicit bias or unintentional bias is by making it explicit, is actually by making people aware of what it looks like and feels like, and taking it from autopilot in the way people think to their more critical thought processes. Making implicit bias explicit is the first step. The second step is to replace implicit bias with other ways of thinking of the world. And that takes education and human interaction.
And I think we are out of time. We're
Yep.
probably going to have to leave it there. But all of your research is on ISPU website and certainly has been covered extensively. So thank you,
Thank you,
Dalia.
Hannah.
Thanks.
Thank you.